Hello and welcome back. When we left off last time, the King of Qin had successfully conquered and unified all the warring states, laying the foundation for the China we know today. Now we all know the leader of one kingdom is called a king, but what do you call the leader of 7 kingdoms? King didn't seem grand enough, and so the former king of Qin styled himself Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin. The idea was that this naming convention, first emperor of Qin, second emperor of Qin, third and so on, would continue with his successors down through the ages, but sadly this was not to be. Despite his achievement in conquering the other 6 kingdoms and the changes he made to the structure of his new unified empire, the Qin dynasty was barely to outlive its first emperor, lasting only a few years after his death at the age of 49 in the year 210 BCE. But while his dynasty may not have lasted, his legacy did and does. An incredible achievement for a man who ruled for only 37 years over 2 millennia ago. So who was this historic man, and what did he do to found an empire that would last for over 2,000 years? Qin Shi Huangdi was born Ying Zhen in February 259 BCE in the city of Hanban, which is in modern-day Hebei province. Hebei province is in the east of China and incorporates China's now capital, Beijing. His father was Prince Ying Yiren, later to become king of Qin, and his mother was Zhao Ji. Ying Yiren was, at the time, being held as a political hostage by the kingdom of Zhao in Hanban, the state's capital city. The keeping of political hostages was a common way states used to secure alliances and ensure compliance with treaties. They were usually members of the nobility or royal families, taken from one state and held by another as a guarantee of good faith. Obviously, the primary aim was to deter betrayal and ensure that treaties or alliances would be honoured. The hostages served as a form of leverage, as their safety and well-being were tied to the actions of their home state. The hostages' presence acted as a reminder of the agreement and as a safeguard against breaking it. The use of hostages became a tactical necessity in an era marked by intrigue and betrayal. Hostages were often treated well and educated in their host state, which could lead to greater influence and understanding between states. This practice sometimes resulted in the hostages becoming important political figures in the host state, further intertwining the interests of both. When, as in this case, the hostage was a future king, their experiences could foster diplomatic ties and, in some cases, lead to eventual unification under a single ruler. Not in this case, though, as we'll find out. It was in Handan that Ying Yiren met Liu Buwei, a merchant who was to change Ying's life. First of all, Liu introduced Ying to one of his concubines, Zhao Ji. Apparently, Ying and Zhao fell instantly in love, and with Liu's consent, they married. A year later, Ying Zhen was born. This is about the year 259 BCE, for those of you who like to keep your dates straight. Now, there's a bit of gossip around Zheng's birth, with some saying that the pregnancy was unusually long, and that Zheng was, in fact, the son of Liu. It's unlikely this is the case, although not impossible, I suppose, and it's probably a story concocted after the event to throw a bit of shade on Zheng's legitimacy to the throne. At the time, merchants, no matter how rich, were seen as quite low class, so making Zheng illegitimate and the son of a merchant was quite a slander. As well as providing a wife, Liu managed to get Yiren out of Handan and back to Qin. At the same time, he convinced the current king of Qin's primary spouse, who was childless, to adopt Yiren, making him heir to the throne. When Yiren became king, Zhao Ji became his queen consort, i.e. married to a king but not a queen, and Liu became his grand chancellor, the highest position in the government. Young Ying Zhen was just 10 years old. 3 years later, he was king. As a prince, Zheng's early education will have focused on military strategy, governance, and philosophy, in particular one of the 100 schools of thought we talked about last time, legalism. The state of Qin had adopted and implemented legalism long before Zheng was born, which means it's likely that legalism was the focus of his philosophical and governmental education. For about 100 years before Zheng's birth, the state of Qin had been exploring new ideas of centralized bureaucracy and the rule of law, rather than the old feudal model. We can also be reasonably confident that legalism was the focus of his education by looking at what Zheng did later in his life. Anyway, Zheng's father died in 246 BCE, of what history doesn't record. Yin Zhen ascended to the throne, but being so young, he was only 13, in reality it was Liu Bei that actually presided over the state. And he seems to have done a fairly reasonable job. He consolidated the new king's authority within the kingdom and expanded the borders of Qin through military campaigns against its neighbours. But it seems that Liu had a fatal flaw. The scheming that enabled him to rise to his lofty position was the very thing that caused his downfall. Remember the doctrine of the mandate of heaven? The mandate to rule would be revoked if the emperor did not behave well, if they were corrupt, or if they were weak. If the dynasty falls, it can only be because the mandate of heaven has been withdrawn, and the mandate is only withdrawn if the leader misbehaves. Much of what we know about Yin Zhen, if not most of it, comes from a history written about 100 years after his death by the grand scribe of the Han dynasty, the dynasty that overthrew the Qin. This being the case, it seems reasonable to assume much of what we know may be a little, shall we say, biased. An employee of the Han is highly unlikely to have penned a panegyric to Yin Zhen, so this probably accounts for some of the negative stories about him. It was in the Han's interest to paint Zheng and his successor as corrupt, so as to legitimize the Han's assumption of the mandate of heaven. Bear that in mind as we go through this, so pinches of salt at the ready. This also gets a bit fruity, so bear this in mind. Anyway, by all accounts, Yin Zhen's mother, Zhao Ji, was a bit of a wild one and conducted many scandalous affairs. Liu feared that if this came to light, he would get the blame. Well, I'm not sure why. So he found a particularly well-endowed man, Lao Ai, and put it about that he was packing. Zhao heard about this, was interested, and Liu introduced them. He then got someone in the palace to accuse Lao of a crime punishable by castration and told Zhao to bribe the officer in charge of the castration and have him pluck Lao's beard and eyebrows instead, making it look like he was a eunuch and allowing him to become a servant to Zhao. That then enabled her to ennoble him, meaning he became influential within the court, and because the position came with an army, he had some military might too. Not bad for someone whose only qualification seems to have been that he was really well hung. Obviously, despite his inverted commas castration, he was still producing testosterone without any difficulty because he was thinking aggressively enough to attempt to take control of the government. The idea being that he would put himself on the throne, replacing Yin Zhen. However, the plot was foiled by officials loyal to the king, and the whole affair ended up with Lao Ai executed, being torn apart by 5 horses, Zhao Ji disgraced and under house arrest, and Liu Bei exiled to the south of the kingdom, never to return. Liu Wei's motivations for introducing Lao Ai to Zhao Ji were likely rooted in his desire to maintain influence and control over the court. As a powerful chancellor and regent to the young Yin Zhen, Liu had a vested interest in ensuring that Zhao Ji remained loyal to him. By orchestrating the relationship between Zhao Ji and Lao Ai, Liu may have hoped to secure her favour and keep her dependent on him for political and personal matters. However, this plan backfired spectacularly, and Liu Bei was replaced as chancellor by Li Si, who, fun fact, was also to meet a sticky end after becoming embroiled in a power struggle with a eunuch. I include this little tale not to sex things up, well, not just to sex things up, but as an example of the kind of intrigue and plotting that swirled around the court. Becoming and remaining king was not an easy task. But as I said at the start, take all this with a pinch of salt and remember its source. Not all of the details may be reliable. By this time, 235 BCE, Ying Zhen was 24 years old and had assumed full control of the state of Qin and turned his attention to the states around him. As we covered in the last episode, one by one they fell, leaving him in full control in 221 BCE at the age of 38 years old. Calling himself Qin Shi Huangdi, later shortened to Qin Shi Huang, he turned his attention to changing his empire and consolidating his grasp on power. Before we get into that, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider the name he gave himself. The Qin part is obvious, that was his family name, and Shi means first, but Huangdi was new and carried a lot of symbolic weight. Huang means august or majestic, but Di is especially meaningful because it was the name of the supreme god worshipped by the Shang over 1,000 years previously. Since that time, various figures had been elevated to the level of Di for such achievements as invented cooking, medicine, agriculture, and so on, but Ying Zhen was purposefully lifting himself to their level and making sure everybody knew it. He wasn't the first to have the idea. Many men before him had tried to elevate themselves, but he was the first to succeed at it. He gave himself a title that was to be assumed by his successors for the next 2,000 years until the very last of the emperors. So, back to the newly named Qin Shi Huang. According to custom, it was necessary to assign the symbols with which he and his rule would be associated. The House of Zhou had ruled through the power of fire, and the next of the 5 elements was water, so the House of Qin would rule through the power of water. The colour black and the number 6 were associated with water, and so they were adopted by the emperor. Banners were black, flags and pennants were black, robes and hats were black, hats were 6 inches long, carriages were 6 feet wide, the imperial carriage had 6 horses, and so on and so on. Having sorted all that out, the real business began: how to tighten his grip on his new empire. Having adopted 6 new kingdoms, Qin Shi Huang found himself once again with a network of princes and nobles, the very system he had eradicated in the kingdom of Qin. Realizing that this network was, essentially, the foundation for the warring states in the first place, on the advice of Li Si, Qin Shi Huang did what worked previously. He abolished the feudal system and divided the empire into 36 provinces, each with its own governor, its own army, and an inspector. This civil administration was the first step in truly uniting the warring states and binding the country together as one. What to do with the nobles, though? Well, in a keep your friends close but keep your enemies closer move, Qin Shi Huang ordered them all to move, all 100,000+ families, to the capital near modern-day Xi'an, where he constructed a vast network of palaces and gardens for them to live in. Having them so close made them much easier to keep an eye on, and it also stripped them of their traditional sources of power and livelihood, forcing them to rely solely on the emperor. As you can imagine, this move wasn't universally popular with the nobles. While some adapted to the new regime and took up roles in the new civil administration, others remained unhappy and resentful, waiting for their opportunity to rebel, which was to come after Qin Shi Huang's death. But for now, the problem of the nobles was solved, and the country was under one system of government heavily based on legalist principles. It wasn't practical for one country to have a different script depending on where you were in the country, so writing was standardized, although spoken Chinese varies from place to place still to this day. I remember watching 2 colleagues, one from Beijing and the other from Shanghai, having to converse in English because neither could understand the other's Chinese. The script that Qin Shi Huang and his officials imposed remains, with very little alteration, in use today. Just think about that for a second. Many classical texts dating back even to this period in history are still readable today. Imagine what that must do for a country's sense of continuity, of a connection with its past, of the access this allows to philosophy and literature, or for historians today, to the primary sources of the ages they study without the need for translation. Along with writing, weights and measures, carriage gauges, and the measure of roads were all standardized. One way of doing things consistently throughout the land. Standardizing the gauges and the manufacture of roads enabled Qin Shi Huangdi to build a network of roads across the empire, including the construction of a number of motorway-type roads branching out from the capital to the north, northeast, southeast, and the south. These roads were about 40 feet wide, and the central lane was reserved for the emperor and family on pain of death if anyone else used it. Traffic penalties were quite harsh in those days. This strengthened the lines of communication between the capital and the outermost parts of the country, and also facilitated trade along those routes. It also meant that the emperor could move his armies around quickly if he needed to. This is exactly the same principle as the Roman roads being constructed at about the same time across the Roman Republic. The other thing that needed standardization was money. Chinese currency has always differed from Western currency in one key way. In the West, the value of the coin was usually closely linked to the value of the metal, its weight and purity that made up the coin. In China, however, the value of the coin was based on the inscription, not the metal. They were likely made from inferior or lower quality metals or alloys, but the face value was legally defined. This means that Chinese currency from its earliest days has always relied on the authority of the state to back the value of the coins. So what about the authority of the state? Having unified, how do you govern? To think about that a little, we might need to take a step back and look at another key figure of this age, one who might possibly be even more significant than Qin Shi Huangdi, his chancellor and advisor Li Si. I mentioned Li a little earlier in a throwaway comment about eunuchs, but that wasn't fair to his legacy or to his significance at the time. Li was a politician from the state of either Han or Chu. I found sources that said both. Wherever he was from, he recognized that his future was limited in his home state and so moved to Qin, becoming a guest of Liu Buhui, who you'll remember at the time was the chancellor. Liu introduced Li to King Yingzhen, and during their conversations, Li expressed the belief that, as powerful as Qin was, it could not overcome the other 6 states if they combined. One of Li's first pieces of advice to the future emperor was in opposition to a potential ban on foreigners in the kingdom. Li Si, to be sure, had a personal interest in this, being a foreigner himself, but his argument to Yingzhen was persuasive. Good advisors to kings of the other warring states should be provided, wooed, bribed, kidnapped, whatever it took, to move to Qin for their talents to serve the king. Those that failed to take up this opportunity should be assassinated. In this way would the Qin strengthen itself at the cost of the other states. Li continued to offer advice to Yingzhen as the wars progressed, and in 238 BCE became the chancellor, working with Yingzhen to dispatch the remaining warring states. Once that had been done, the challenge was to rule, and here Li Si had some sage advice. It goes something like, you won the country on horseback, but you cannot rule the country on horseback, meaning what got you here won't keep you here. Having won through fear and military might, that wasn't enough to rule, at least not successfully. Military conquest was effective for unification, governance required a different approach. Ruling through strict laws and harsh punishments would lead to resentment among the populace and potential rebellion, so he suggested that Qin Shi Huangdi should adopt a more benevolent approach, emphasizing the importance of earning the loyalty and support of the people rather than relying solely on fear. This would require reforms that addressed the needs and grievances of the common people. While Qin Shi Huangdi initially seems to have been skeptical of this advice, believing in the effectiveness of his legalist policies, he did recognize the necessity of maintaining stability. But his inclination towards strict control often overshadowed the need for more humane governance. Qin Shi Huangdi was up to the task of unifying the country, but when it came to transitioning from a military leader to a statesman capable of managing a diverse and large empire, he seems to have been less successful, contributing to discontent and unrest in the years following his death. Qin Shi Huangdi's legalist approach relied on a system of strict laws and harsh punishments to maintain order and discipline within the state, and aiming to create a centralized authority through a rigid legal framework. To maintain stability, the last thing the emperor wanted was people who disagreed with him or who argued, so he took steps to ensure this wouldn't happen. Firstly, and this seems again to have been on Li Si's advice, he issued a ruling that outside of the court scholars, no one had any business needing books that weren't about medicine, agriculture, or divination. Therefore, these books should be destroyed. This is an interesting ruling because it will obviously have included books of history, and some sources say this is exactly what was being targeted, especially the histories of the losing states. This was, in effect, an attempt to erase them from history. He who controls the present controls the past. However, this ruling also included 2 books from Confucius, and generally seems to run contrary to Confucian philosophy, which was one of the stronger schools of thought in the country at the time. Confucianism puts great store in tradition and social continuity. It's a fundamentally conservative philosophy in this respect. One of the reasons why Qin Shi Huangdi was ordering books to be destroyed was to stop people arguing with him, and in particular to stop them from being able to point out that whatever he was doing wasn't like what previous rulers had done, and that he should have been following tradition. Sadly, it didn't work, and even though they lacked books, scholars continued to criticize him. Believing that this would unsettle the public and incite revolt, and, I'm sure, having absolutely nothing to do with the dislike of being questioned, Qin Shi Huangdi executed 460 scholars by, according to sources, burying them alive. It's not really clear whether this did the trick and whether it even happened in the first place. There are contemporaneous sources from scholars that fail to mention any such event, and the main report of this comes from the Han source I mentioned previously. Even if it's true, it's not clear the extent to which the ruling to destroy books was followed, and Qin Shi Huangdi was certainly not the last emperor to attempt this method of suppressing dissent. According to Han sources, in 211 BCE, a large meteor fell to Earth, and someone carved on it the words, "The first emperor will die, and his lands will be divided." Hearing of this, Qin Shi Huangdi dispatched a secretary to investigate. But the secretary could find no one to own up to this, so everyone in the area was killed and the stone destroyed. Qin Shi Huangdi died the following year in 210 BCE, after just 11 years as emperor. It's not clear what killed him. By all accounts, he was afraid of dying, and some of the treatments he took to stave off death may have involved mercury, which will have had quite the opposite effect. It may just have been overwork. Running an empire was an exhausting business, and whatever faults he had, Qin Shi Huangdi seems to have been diligent in keeping up with his paperwork, reading 30 kilos of reports a day. The emperor had been touring the country when he died, and Li Si concealed his death until he was able to get the body back to the capital, going to extraordinary lengths to make it look like the emperor was still alive during the 2-month-long journey. He was afraid that if news leaked out before they were back in the capital and the succession sorted, there would be revolt. After some machinations, Qin Shi Huangdi's son Ying Hu-hei assumed the throne as the second emperor at the age of 19, but his reign was not to last, and he was forced to kill himself only 3 years later at the age of 22, and the Qin dynasty collapsed shortly afterwards. There are 2 physical reminders that Qin Shi Huangdi left us, neither of which are visible from space, but which are nonetheless huge. Firstly, there is, of course, the Great Wall, which in reality is not one Great Wall, but a lot of really good walls. Many of the warring kingdoms had constructed walls to the north of their territories to keep out northern invaders, and the earliest parts of the Great Wall date back to 700 BCE. It was Qin Shi Huang, however, who began to connect these separate walls to provide a defence from barbarians. The other reminder of the first emperor lay hidden for 2,000 years until 1974, when farmers drilling a well discovered an underground chamber. Investigating further, archaeologists discovered an army of around 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers, each with individually detailed faces. Alongside this army were chariots of wood and bronze, iron farm implements, bronze and leather bridles, silks, linens, jade and bone carvings, as well as bows and arrows, spears and swords, cast from an unusual 13-element alloy, which are still sharp and shiny today. This army forms part of a funeral compound covering 50 square kilometres, which it's estimated took around 700,000 workers more than 30 years to complete. At construction, it was 120 metres high, although some has eroded now. Most of the compound remains covered, and it will take decades to uncover it all. As well as the soldiers, servants and animals, and a lake of mercury, incredibly, Qin Shi Huang was buried with all of his concubines who had produced no sons, as well as all the surviving workmen. Perhaps not surprising that a man who in life was so afraid of death should take so many people with him on his final journey. Qin Shi Huang's unification of China was a complex process that involved military might, political acumen, and extensive reforms. His efforts laid the foundation for a centralized imperial system that would influence Chinese governance for centuries to come, despite the harshness of his rule leading to significant resistance and the eventual fall of the Qin dynasty shortly after his death. His actions were driven by a combination of practical needs for stability and control, economic ambitions, military considerations, and a desire for historical legacy. His vision of a unified China was rooted in both pragmatic governance and ideological beliefs, fundamentally shaping the course of Chinese history. After unification, the dynasties that followed, such as the Han, the Tang, and the Song, centralized power significantly, but the Qin set the template, establishing a more bureaucratic state, diminishing the power of regional lords, and implementing standardized laws and measurements. A more unified system of governance with appointed officials and a civil service, which continued to evolve in later dynasties, promoted meritocracy and a more systematic approach to administration. The Qin codified laws became a basis for later legal systems. Qin Shi Huang is the man history remembers as being the unifier of China, but there's something really interesting in his story beyond this. Two figures loom large behind him, without either of which, I would argue, he wouldn't have been so successful. Liu Buhui was the man who saw his father's potential and plucked him from obscurity, placing him in a position to lead the Qin. Li Si was the man whose ideas, a single written language, standardization of weights, measures, and so on, Qin Shi Huang was to implement and for which, in part, he is remembered. Of course, there is the argument that one of the skills of a great leader is knowing who to listen to and knowing when the advice you're being given is correct. And that's certainly true. Qin Shi Huang clearly exercises good judgment in selecting his advisors and following the advice he was given, even with Liu Buhui, whose efforts to move Ying Yiren into a position of power would have come to nothing if Qin Shi Huang hadn't been able to take advantage of his opportunity. I'm not trying to suggest for 1 minute that Qin Shi Huang was merely a pawn in the game of others, or that he had no contribution to make to his own success. But remove either Liu or Li from the story, and history could well go in a very different way. Had Yin Yiren not been adopted and become king, had Yin Zhen decided not to follow Li Xi's advice, or even expelled him, would China still have been unified? It's interesting to speculate, but the thing it really proves to me is that the idea of the great man in history is a fallacy. There's never one great man or woman. What happens is always the result of the efforts of many people, not all of whom are remembered. Outside of China, Liu and Li are, I would venture to suggest, hardly known at all outside academic circles. Within China, they are much better known, appearing as characters often in historical fiction. Their impact on history, their legacy, far outweighs their fame. With Yin Zhen, the first emperor of China, the three of them changed the world. Next time, we look at the emperor who developed and expanded the Silk Road, opening up a new world of trade, Han Wudi. But for now, thanks very much for listening. See you next time.